Hello, my name is Rachel Harris from Midland, Texas. I'm almost fourth-year grad student under the guidance of my amazing advisor, Razvan Jelka, here at Texas Tech University. Go Red Raiders! In this talk, I would like to explore the use of software in performing Skein computations in knot complements. Recall that the knot complement is obtained by removing a neighborhood of the knot in S3. For the moment, we restrict ourselves to the rather large family of two-bridge knots. This is because the basis of the Skein module of the knot complement in this case is well understood thanks to the work of Tong Lei. Skein modules, introduced by Józef Czetyczki, extend knot polynomials to knots and links in arbitrary 3 manifolds. After his work, we can compute skeins in certain manifolds, in our case, the complement of certain knots. The result of this computation can be written in terms of a particular basis. Now we are working in the Reshetikhin-Turaev setting, with Skein relations found by Paul Melvin. As a grad student, part of my research and the research of several students before me has been computing specific examples of these skeins in the RT normalization. While pretty straightforward, these computations can get long. Let's see what such a computation might look like. As an example, consider the left-handed trefoil. We can take a curve that runs around the longitude of the knot, with a couple of twists to account for the crossings. This particular curve is the curve 1, 0, once around, and it doesn't cross the meridian. We push it inside into the knot complement. Now, the curve has 3 self-intersections, and we can use the given Skein relations to resolve them. To resolve a crossing, we smoothen it in 2 possible ways: top and bottom, and side to side. This produces a new curve for each smoothening. As you already know, we get 2 curves each time we resolve a crossing, and this exponential process means that for n crossings, we have 2 to the n curves to keep track of. The organizational effort required for this type of computation is substantial. Not that I don't enjoy a good computation, but this is just for the trefoil, and the number of crossings only goes up from here. Here's an example of another curvy computation from my advisor, Razvan Jelka's 2001 paper. This is still for a really nice curve and a really simple basis that we're computing in terms of. I wanted to prove lemma 7 for the same situation with a slightly modified set of Skein relations. These computations are easy to perform, in theory, but when we get down to it, I had to watch my signs really carefully. As vigilant as I was, the highlighted boxes are where I messed up on signs on several terms. Error propagates very quickly, and you'll start to notice as you get to the end of the computation that things just don't work out. These problems have, in the past, always given beautiful answers, with most of the terms canceling out at the end. So if stuff doesn't start canceling, maybe it's a sign that you messed up, pun fully intended. Many awesome software packages already exist for computing knot invariants, like the Kaufman bracket and the Jones polynomial, and this program can be used to compute those too. However, what makes this program different is its application to a much broader scene than verifying previous work. We can begin to work with Skein manipulations in arbitrary manifolds with a whole new level of output. In fact, the program can even be used to compute the relations provided by Czetyczki for handle slides. As it stands, a single example can take several months of dedicated work, and we just don't have enough examples. Such a Skein manipulator can generate a library of examples. But what can we do with such examples? These examples can be used for experimentation and testing conjectures, particularly for testing new conjectures in Chern-Simons theory. This may be a good time to mention that the program has been written to use the Skein relations of either the Kaufman bracket or the Jones polynomial in the Reshetikhin-Turaev normalization. In fact, the Skein relations can be input before the program is implemented, and the results of using different Skein relations can be compared. These Skein relations and the algorithms have been incorporated into a program I fondly call Resolve. Now let's see how this program works in the same example as before. As before, consider the 1, 0 curve on the left-handed torus. We take this curve and push it into the knot complement. To input this knot into the program, we convert to a kind of braid representation by cutting along some non-interacting strands. Notice that no part of the curve we resolve has been cut, and we do need to remember our connecting information for later. We then rotate the picture until we have a picture that can be read from bottom to top. Now it's much easier to convert the diagram to an array, which is what I plan to use as the program input. But it still needs a little bit of work. The knot to be projected has to also read in a bottom to top approach. And to accomplish this, we're kind of going to stretch out the ends of it And then do a similar trick like we did before. We'll cut it at non-interfering strands and make sure we record the connecting information. Now we have a diagram that reads bottom to top, and we can further separate this diagram into sections. Section 1 at the bottom, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4, 3 crossings, 4 sections. At this point, it might be helpful to note that this entire program has been structured with a left side bias. Now, it certainly doesn't have to be this way. In fact, all the strands could be on the right side, and it would be just as good of a program, or they could be on both the left and the right. But having all the strands on the left side simplifies the computations and simplifies the way that we represent this diagram as an array. Strands start and end on the left, and so we never have to worry about 2 sections not meeting up, and the terrible things that can go along with that. Therefore, if we do have strands meeting up on the right, we can easily move them underneath until they appear on the left. And this has done essentially nothing but introduce a Reitemeister move. Even the crossings we've introduced are not self-crossings, and so they won't increase the computational complexity of the result. Now we're going to project this knot from the bottom section to the top section by sliding along the original knot. This will put all the crossings to be resolved in the same section, along a straight section of the knot. The advantage to this in one particular case is obvious. Consider twist knots. All twist knots could be written in a form like this, where the curve is pulled to the twisted section, and the diagram would look like this one, only with more sections. At that point, the red curve could be projected to the 2-punctured disc, and all crossings would result in some elementary curve. But for now, we're contented with simply projecting the red curve to the top section in this diagram. With this terminology, we call the original knot the base knot, and the red curve we can suggestively call the knot to be projected. In the base knot, the strands are labeled left to right, starting from strand 1, as in many other popular braid representations. We note the number of strands in the base knot, and then we encode each of the crossings in the base knot by noting which of the strands is the smaller in the 2. So for example, if the crossing is between strands 1 and 2, we'll remember the number 1, and we'll also remember a positive or negative. Now the sign convention is a little bit different than it probably should be, but that's more of a function of inexperience at the time that I wrote it. I have the sign convention as strand 1 going over strand 2 gives you a positive value, and going under strand 2 gives you a negative value. So for the base knot in our example, we have the crossings with values positive 1, and positive 1. The knot to be projected, however, runs around and around, in and out, over and under the strands, so it's a little harder to encode. Now we're going to read it section by section, starting with the bottom section. Nothing's happening in the bottom section, so you have to enter kind of a dummy variable to say that that section is empty. The next section up, we're going to read the digits in order. If it goes under strand 1, we give a negative 1. Over strand 2 is a positive 2. So the array in this section would read negative 1, positive 2, negative 2, positive 1. In the next section, we hit a crossing first, and so we have to label all of our crossings with some value. Now those values can't interfere with the values of the strands, so they can't be integer values, and their ordering doesn't really matter. So we've labeled them 0.01, 0.02, etc. And at this point, the notation can only get you up to 0.99, but then you can go further than that, 0.999, 0.99999, and it will organize itself fairly well and not interfere with the labeling on the strands in the base knot. So the next section reads positive 0.01 and then negative 0.02. Now at this point you may have noticed we've stayed only on one continuous strand and we're ignoring the other. There are essentially 2 components to this knot to be projected. Now it's not really that there are 2 components, in fact we need to remember the connecting information from the bottom of the picture to the top of the picture, but at this point we're going to treat them as if they're separate components. So if we start with component 1, we can read the bottom section as empty, and then the next section up would also be empty, and we only get something in finally the third section. We get a negative 0.01, negative 1, positive 2, negative 2, positive 1, positive 0.02, and we leave that section. And then the top section we only have one value, negative 0.03. In the next component, we continue as we did before, listing all the numbers section by section from the bottom to the top. Now let's see what this actually looks like in terms of the program. So we'll start back with the base knot. We enter the number of crossings in the base knot, in this case, 3 crossings. Then we enter the strand index of the smaller strand in each crossing of the base knot. And that in this case would be between strands 1 and 2, so that's where we're entering the 1. Now the sign of each of those crossings in the base knot was positive, and so we're going to enter a positive 1. If the sign was negative, we would enter a negative 1. The number of components, so to say, in the projected knot is the number of components in that diagram, so we're going to enter 2. Then we enter the crossings section by section. Now notice with the empty crossing, we couldn't just enter anything empty. I've entered a 1 and a 1 because a 1 means over strand 1, and another 1 means over strand 1 again, and those two overs cancel each other out. Also, I've entered the value 100 to separate the sections, assuming we'll never get to a knot with 100 strands, and if we do, I sure need to change that part of the program. Fortunately, it's a pretty easy thing to fix. But for now, we'll keep it for convenience. So every time I enter a new section, I'm going to enter the number 100, and the 100s will separate the sections. We enter all the information for the first component of the projected knot, section by section. And then we do the same thing with the second component, entering the 1, 1 for the empty strand. When we get to the end, we enter one last 100 to break off the last section. Despite the dramatization, it actually does compute everything in the blink of an eye. And in the end result, we're left with both components, but now they're listed with additional crossings because they've been twisted a bit as they've run through the base knot. But we've gone from a diagram that looks like this to a diagram that looks like this. Globally, after we push the knot inside, it's kind of like we just moved it down to the straight section at the bottom. And now, for one final chore, we need to get it to where the knot is going under, over, over, under, over, in a predictable pattern, kind of like alternating, but definitely alternating over a particular strand. So on strand 1, it needs to be alternating under, over, and on strand 2, it needs to be alternating under, over. To do this, we can introduce twists at specified locations, and these locations are easy to predict because if you start counting over, under, you see where the pattern breaks, and that's where a twist needs to be introduced. These twists increase the self-crossing count, but not in a terribly bad way. Now all crossings, the original crossings and these new twist crossings, can be resolved in all possible ways, and this gives us curves of a very specified form. Curves in this form can be solved very methodically, by twisting and resolving one at a time from bottom to top. Throw a little computer power behind it and you have yourself a very fast resolution machine. The important part of this is that we've reduced these complex curves in a predictable way to a set of predictable curves. These curves can then be solved in terms of a particular basis, and that basis can be selected based on the problem. In this case, I have an example of 2 strands, where an element around one strand would be the variable x, and an element around 2 strands would be the variable y. And these curves on the right can now be quickly resolved in terms of these basis elements. And now for some generalization. So the curve in the previous example had only 2 strands in the base knot. But this idea can certainly extend to more strands, and in fact I already wrote the program for n number of strands so I wouldn't have to go back and do the same work again later. Now I'm not sure if that's laziness or ingenuity, but either way we're ready to start looking at other families of knots. On a final note, have you ever seen those little things underneath playground equipment that are tic-tac-toe boards? In the case of the one in my neighborhood, it happens to be baseballs and baseball bats. As I was walking by, I noticed that the baseball bats happened to look like crossings, and I stopped to think it would be pretty funny to take a picture and maybe put it in this PowerPoint presentation. However, upon closer inspection, I came to the shocking realization that when you turn around the baseball bats, you get a baseball, and the baseball looks like the smoothing of the curve, so I guess it's a good way to introduce kids to Skein relations early in life. I would really like to thank the conference organizers, Carmen and Christine, for not giving up on us and making this carbon-neutral conference a reality. My only regret is that I don't get to tell Dr. Kaufman how much I enjoyed his 2018 Chalk Talk video from KITP posted on YouTube, and about how I tried to do what he did in the video with the knot and the string, but ended up tying myself in knots.